Hello again. So slightly louder voice now compared to the last session, but I have worked out how to add closed captions to the lecture video, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me or at least understand me, and I'll add them going forward. So today we are talking about translation, the problem of translation, and specifically translating poetry. So this lecture, I kind of want us to think about the idea of what language is, how language is structured, how it is not a closed system, how it has this infinite prismic potential, and how the object lesson of the work of a poet called Stéphane Mallarmé can really capture this. So Stéphane Mallarmé was writing in France at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. So he's playing with language in an interesting way. So if we're thinking about art during this time in France at the end of the 19th century, we have the rise of Impressionism. And this is obviously to do with thinking about and representing the world not in a clear and rational and normal or a mirror-like way, a realistic way, but in a more something that captures the complexity of reality. That there is something to reality that is more than its manifest form. That there is something to reality that is divided, that is subjective, that is more than just what you see in a basic way. This is something that we'll come on to in psychoanalysis. There is a through line between, because psychoanalysis is really the study of subjectivity, it's the questions, the philosophy of subjectivity. If this poem by Mallarmé is making us think philosophically about language, Marx, as we saw last time, is thinking philosophically about the economy, and we have the likes of Freud and Lacan thinking philosophically about subjectivity, what it means to be a perceptive thinking subject. So Mallarmé is a symbolist poet at the end of the 19th century who is actually a school teacher. Interestingly, it's interesting sometimes to think about some of these canonical writers and thinkers who one imagines, this is the logic of capitalism, there's maybe some exception there that they live a life of riches or that they're celebrated in their own time. Often that's not the case. Hegel, who is one of the greatest philosophers of all time, was actually a private tutor in his 40s at the time of the publication of the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is one of the greatest works of literature, of thinking, of literature, of any human written form ever. So it's quite an interesting thing. So Mallarmé was a teacher in France, although teachers do have a good status within society in France. So he was writing and thinking about what language means. And it's interesting because simultaneously at the same time as his writing, as you see in this poem, which is called Un coup de dé n'abolira jamais le hasard, which means a roll of the dice will never obliterate chance. That's the first line of the poem. Sometimes it's just called Un coup de dé. I mean, is it the title? Is it just, the first line of the poem? Un coup de dé, a throw of the dice. There's a really interesting book written by Quentin Meillassoux, I think it was in about 2010, sort of late noughties, early 2010s. He's a philosopher involved in object-oriented ontology, triple O. It had its moment, it sort of passed, but he writes a really interesting book about this poem and about the writer Mallarmé, and looks at this question of contingency. So his argument is it is miracles occur because we live in a materialist, atheistic universe, and basically that there's miracles only are miracles insofar as they are not at the hand of an all-seeing deity who just forms them. Miracles are to do with accidents, that it is possible to roll a double six in this kaleidoscopic, complicated universe we exist in. That's sort of a summary, but he talks about this poem related to that and how he thinks that Mallarmé was writing towards this kind of philosophical position. But today we're just going to look at what it means to translate in relation to poetry. Poetry is a really interesting manifestation of language that is to do with not direct representation of ideas, but indirect representation of ideas. So it's working in a metaphorical way. So metaphor, from ancient Greek, the word meta, which means across, and for, which is from the verb to carry across. So to carry across, having one set of ideas be expressed and situated in another context to illuminate that set of ideas. And Mallarmé is not in the tradition of the history of poetry that's come before him. Things like sonnets, which are using a very specific form. You might have iambic pentameter, you might have a 12-line poem, you might have an A-B rhyme, you might have verses that are structured like a song. Often that form of poetry uses techniques and structures to evoke affect in the reader, to create a collision of sounds and ideas and imagery using a structure that always exists. So you might have a rhyme, so you have a poem that rhymes, and in that rhyme you hear a sound. The language isn't just a signifier that shows a word, it becomes an object in itself that takes on its own aesthetic quality, and you're reminded of the existence of the signifier as separated from the signified. So interestingly, similar period of time, you have a Swiss linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure, who starts to theorize this idea of the difference between the signifier and the signified. You have a word in itself, which is a set of imagistic letters. In some languages, it is actually an image, which exists itself. And then you have the world that's evoked, the signifier, the signified, which is meant by that signifier. So you have the word tree, T-R-E-E, which looks and exists a certain way on a page, and then you have the actual signified, the tree itself, which can be all sorts of different kinds of trees. It can also be used poetically or metaphorically, like we might say somebody's as tall as a tree or something like that. I don't know, that was a bad word to use. And then this is developed by lots of theorists. You have the likes of Derrida, a really interesting deconstructionist theorist in France in the latter part of the 20th century, and he's looking at an idea of différance, which is to do with that which something is not. So when you have a word, he's pointing out how the word actually is meaningful only insofar as there is a gap between the words. So a tree actually means a tree because you have the gap between the a and the word tree. There are lots of different examples of how this might play out, but if you allied words together, they can mean something else. But then also in a poetic sense, you might have a poem that shows how words are similar or different, or how in certain unifications they can mean one thing or another. In Mallarmé's poems, he's often got and it's interesting, there's actually a long history of the signifier in French poetry from the 19th century. Baudelaire uses this signifier a lot, but Mallarmé talks about the word swan, un cygne, C-Y-G-N-E in French, which is also the same word as signe, S-I-G-N-E, which means sign. So he's talking about the sign, the signifier, what things mean, but is also sort of couching this in this poetic language. And, you know, swan is a very sort of poetic, elegant animal that is also quite elusive and has lots of, to human understanding, but also, you know, is to do with, often used in mythology and fairy tales, and in England is actually a royal animal, and you get some kind of like terrible sentence if you harm a swan because the king owns all the swans. Anyway, a bit weird. But basically what Mallarmé is doing in this poem is he's using the image quality of the sign, the signifier, the word itself, in interesting ways, in ways that hadn't been thought about historically up to that point in, you know, we might say canonical Western literature. It's interesting, and there's a really interesting writer, Roland Barthes, who talks about, he has a book, he's a literary theorist. He came up with the literary theory that's really pervasive and really important, called the death of the author. That when you are doing literary analysis, you're not doing you're not doing a biographical analysis of what's going on in the writer's head when he wrote this, why is it important that he did this, what can we find out about this famous writer in his choice of words. He's actually looking at separating the text from the author, so we actually read the text as a separate cultural artifact that may tell us something about wider society and all sorts of different things, but we have to separate the text from the author. But Barth wrote a really interesting text about Japan called The Empire of Signs, and he's looking at, from an exterior perspective, how the signifier might work in a society where the sign itself has a more imagistic quality and has this quality that maybe Mallarmé is trying to evoke in his explosive, imagistic use of the word and manipulation of the word. He is throwing words all over the page, so it's a roll of the dice will never obliterate chance. So this contingency chance is evoked in the very structure of the image of white against black against white on the page, and your eye can dart in all sorts of different ways. You can read it in different orders. You're reading the text in all sorts of different ways. So he's really thinking about this. What is a signifier? What is a sign? What does it mean? He's starting to explode this one-to-one relationship between the image and the thing, between the word as image or the word as sound and what it represents. It's interesting because French is quite an interesting language to do this through. France has a history of control relative to its language. So it has this Académie Française, which is this top-down government organisation that decides how the language is going to be adapted and developed over time. Obviously, there are changes in the way we speak over time. If we look at English from the Middle Ages, it's very different from today. And some of these are natural changes that occur. But it's very governed in a very precise way in France. And for instance, spellings are governed in this way. And it's interesting because over time in France, you have the elision of certain sounds. So words that were written in different ways and are still written in different ways are pronounced the same way in France. So in the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, one interesting sound is the... Actually, I will come on to that in a different session because that's the schwa. I wanted to talk about the schwa, but I'm going to talk about here the E, acute E, A sound. And the IPA, that is just written as a lowercase e, the A sound. So the A sound is really pervasive in French. It is spelt in about 30 different ways. You can write E with an accent, E with an accent followed by an E with an accent followed by an E and an S, E with an accent and an S, AI, AIT, AIENT, ET, EZ, these are just off the top of my head, all sorts of different ways. So in the past, there may have been different ways that people pronounced that those ways that, AI might have been spoken in a slightly different way to E with an accent going up. But over time, for simplicity's sake, people haven't needed to articulate those words differently. They're still understood in the way they articulate them. But the written word is actually pointing to a singular sound despite having 30 different ways of writing it. So there's a weird way in which French is not quite so logical in its articulation visually of sounds that exist in the language. But because there are so many similar sounds in French, there's a lot of rhyme that can occur. And this is potentially why French rap is actually quite good. So Mallarmé is coming from this tradition of this French, and also contemporary, in a contemporary sense, so is French rap. It's coming from this history of poetry that is very important in French culture, and he's exploding it. He's doing something different to it. He's looking at things pictorially in a different way. But when we look at this poem on the page, as I've said, one thing that happens is your eye can be drawn in all sorts of different ways. So this is drawing out the subjectival import of the reader themselves, that the text comes to life through the subjectivity of the reader. To go back to Roland Barthes, this is called a writerly text. So he has a readerly text and a writerly text. Readerly texts for Roland Barthes are literary texts that basically just are self-explanatory, that tell you what is going on, that make it very clear so the reader doesn't have to do any thinking about what they are reading. But the writerly text does something different. It challenges the reader and it shows the reader's own act of reading and writing in creating the text in their head. And I think that Mallarmé's poem goes a step further because it actually points out the ways in which the reader has to choose their own adventure in the way in which that they're reading this text. So when we are translating, this conundrum of language is something that we have to deal with. Because of the way that the signifier and signified relate in a loose way, in psychoanalysis we say that words never do what they say on the tin. There's always something else that comes with the word. In psychoanalysis, in the logic of metonymy, which is something that we'll go into in that session on psychoanalysis, words act in chains, a chain of signifiers, like an incomplete electron in chemistry. They latch onto another word and work in chains. So words lead to other words, and words lead to other words for people in all sorts of different ways. When you think about when you're lying in bed at night and you're trying to sleep, often we go on a journey in our heads and when we think of one thing and another thing and another thing and another thing, and often this chain is very manifestly to do with the way that signifiers relate to another. I'm really interested in this British detective show called Lewis, and I was thinking about that the other day. And then I go on to a friend of mine who's got the surname Lewis, and she's into gardening. Then I go into gardening. So this is our brains kind of work in this way. And in a sense, Mallarmé is kind of showing that in this poem, that all of these words are going off in different directions, and we can have our capture drawn in different directions. So if the reader is bringing their own subjectivity into the text, how can the translator, who is also bringing in their subjectivity by reading, the very act of reading the poem, going to transfer this in the exact way into another language? The fact that they can't speaks to the fact that words don't uniformly relate to one another in their own language, and they don't also in another language. So you have this dual issue of each language has its own relationship, signifier to signified, which is a symbol of the incomplete nature of subjectivity, whence language is born, and our subjectivity is a result of language. This is something we'll go on to in the psychoanalysis seminar. But also that in each individual language, because of the quantum nature of the universe and language itself, there's an explosion that can go off in any different direction. One interesting word I always like to think about is the word apple. And apple is not just the word apple. It doesn't just mean for us in English, something we pick from a tree and we eat. It means an apple a day keeps the doctor away. It evokes the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve and the fall of Eden. It evokes the Big Apple, America, New York. It evokes an Apple laptop, which I'm using at the moment. So our minds relate to these words in really, really interesting ways. And then in different languages, there's different sort of cultural baggage that comes with words. So for instance, in America, the word bread is a word that evokes certain ideas. Bread means money. Dough, which also is to do with bread, means money. In France, bread might mean something else. In Christianity, they say, give us this day our daily bread. In the Marxist tradition or in the political left tradition, bread means to do with, workers getting the subsistence they deserve, bread and roses. In France, bread might be more to do with, whilst in America we have this disgusting sliced white bread that returns to dough when you squid it. In France, it might be to do with tradition and eating bread that is from a boulangerie that you buy on the day. In the Jewish tradition, it might evoke the Sabbath with the kind of breads that they use. So there's all these different universes that exist in the cultural reality of each language. So when we translate a word, we're actually bringing our own baggage from one language into another. That's something we have to think about and means it's sort of impossible to translate. Another question is just to do with the ways in which the language itself works on an oral or purely material structure. And these cannot be echoed in the same way in another language. I always think that perhaps the most difficult phrase to translate into another language is "the cat sat on the mat." This is because when we have this phrase, which is a phrase that's used to do with nursery rhymes in the English language for young children, not only does it evoke a universe, so this whole universe, when we say a cat sat on the mat in French, it might not have the same evocation for a child that it does in the English-speaking world, to do with nursery rhymes and this kind of thing, and it being one of the first things you learn, and you learn about rhyme, and it's a sort of elementary school kind of phrase. But also you have the onomatopoeia, cat sat on the mat. You have the fact that these are three, cat sat on the mat. It's three repetitious words that have visual rhyme, C-A-T, S-A-T, M-A-T, oral rhyme. You have a really harsh, repetitious, rhythmic sound. When you literally translate the word of a cat sitting on a mat, un chat assis sur un tapis. Funnily enough, assis, sat, tapis, mat, it does have a rhyme, but it's not the same. Chat is like C-H-A-T, is visually similar and orally similar to cat in English, but the other two words aren't, so you don't evoke that rhythm and rhyme. And when you're translating, these are all things that come up that remind us that it is impossible, that language itself is impossible. As we'll see in the psychoanalysis lecture, language is much more than just a word. It's much more than just even the question of signifier and signified. Language is the result of our divided subjectivity, of our impossibility of communicating with our lacking parents as infants. I won't get into this now because it's a really complicated psychoanalytic idea, but I will do it in the lecture on psychoanalysis. But when we translate, if we're translating, I'm not familiar with languages in Asia, for instance, that use a more pictorial form. How can we evoke that universe that's created in that sign when we translate it into another language? One thing that's interesting is I used to do a lot of work as a translator. And over the years, with the rise of AI, that industry has been massively undermined, which is very sad. Because as you'll see, it's a really difficult thing to do, actually, especially if you're translating a novel or a work of art. You have to not only convey the literal meaning, you have to try to convey the cultural universe, you have to try to convey the artistic universe. Things like, an idiomatic phrase in English, it's raining cats and dogs. Obviously, in different language, it would sound really weird to say it's raining cats and dogs coming from the sky. But you might also try to use a phrase that has a weird, quirky relationship to what it's conveying, but then to get that into a scene that's talking about rain is really, really difficult to do. But AI, unfortunately, is becoming better at, to a certain extent, translating. So what has happened is, from there being lots of jobs where people are employed to translate a whole text, what has happened now is AI, or Google Translate, which is an original form of AI, is able to translate up to a certain point in a mechanistic way. But the jobs that exist in translation now are those that check the translation through, brush it up, and make sure that the computer hasn't done something really stupid and said, like, it's raining cats and dogs in another language, that it doesn't understand the contradictory nature, the obscure, the weird, the uncanny nature of language. When I was I used to be a French teacher back in the day, and I could always tell that the boys I taught in an all-boys school, were using Google Translate because they would come up with phrases in their essays that were very literal. In linguistics, we call this a calque, C-A-L-Q-U-E. And that means a literal attempt to replicate the signifier in another context. So it's interesting because these phenomena exist in loads of different languages. So in French, we can talk about Québécois, which is the French language that exists in Montreal. But it is very, in Quebec, Montreal is part of Quebec, but it's very influenced by American culture because obviously Canada, the majority speak English, and it has America just to the south. So whilst in France, a can of beans, for instance, is une boîte d'haricots, boîte, box of beans. In Canadian French, it is un can de beans. Whilst in francophone, sort of in hexagon France French, they would say a chariot for a trolley. I actually can't remember what it is in Quebec, so I have to think of something else. So whilst in France they say stationner, to park. In American and Canadian French they say parquer son char. Voiture becomes char. So it's influenced by American English. So the thing that's interesting though is that computers often have this problem with calquing. So when I was teaching, often I knew when people were using Google Translate, because they'd say things like, this weekend I played in a football match. And the word for match that Google Translate had picked, because it wasn't capable at the time, this was like 12 years ago, of reading the room, of seeing the context that would actually mean that a choice of another word was necessary. It would say match, as in a match you use to light a candle, instead of a football match, like a competition. I taught at a boarding school, and often they would say things like, there are 25 boarding houses at the school. Boarding, however, would be translated by Google Translate as embarquement, which is boarding a plane. So because computers, and we'll come on to this in the psychoanalysis lecture, do not think in the same way as humans. So humans think in the logic of metonymy. One signifier leads to another signifier based on a relationship that is to do with what is called the chain of signifiers. So one signifier leads us into another. In a computer has this one-to-one attempt where they try to replicate a signifier in another context. They try to calc. They try to predict. It's not even a prediction. It tries to sort of, in its singular form. And because the computers are getting more powerful and better coded or whatever, it can start to look for the words around it. But it will often not pick the right signifier in relation to the wider context. And it will often choose the wrong signifier because it is thinking literally rather than poetically or metonymically that a human can do. But because it is still able to transfer one word in a literal way, instead of it being humans that would translate the whole thing, often what happens now is you have an AI translation, and then a translator will make sure that the right context, and as only a human who is able to think poetically, indirectly, symbolically, metonymically, metaphorically, they're able to point out where it's gone wrong in the text itself. So this is one way, related to our Marx lecture, that tech has undermined human employment. And as we will maybe have, because I'm recording this before our seminar discussion, how the liberation of having less work has actually meant that we're more impoverished and we have less control over the means of production, and we are getting more and more proletarianized, and it's quite a tragedy. But anyway, to go back to the symbolist poet, hopefully you will see in reading the text by Mallarmé that language is explosive, that the signifier has a strange and indirect and not fully connected relationship to the signified. The signifier can explode into many different ways. There are all sorts of things we need to think about when we think about language. Visual representation, something that Derrida's interested in and that Barthes studies when he goes to Japan and writes The Empire of Signs. White against black, the space on the page. We have all sorts of things like rhyme, a metaphor, onomatopoeia, sibilance, all these things, rhythm, are really important. And they also evoke the way in which language is not computational for humans, but evocative, and it leads to other things, and it extends beyond itself from just the representation of meaning to poetry, music, rhythm, stories, universes that can be created for us. And these are things that the question of translating a poem, especially a poem like Mallarmé's poem, lead us to. Anyway, I hope that was informative and that informs your reading of the poem, and I look forward to discussing the poem with you and these ideas in our seminar.